at 1,430 hours on August 16, 1943. Commander Robert Winters, 32 years old, stood on the flight deck of USS Essex at Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, looking across the harbor at USS Enterprise, and Winters understood in that moment that he was watching the transition between two eras of naval warfare, because Enterprise, the carrier that had fought at Midway and Santa Cruz and Guadalcanal, the carrier that had survived more combat than any other ship in the Pacific Fleet, looked small next to Essex, looked obsolete, looked like a relic from a previous generation despite being only 6 years old, and Winters, who had served as Air Operations Officer on Enterprise from 1940 to 1943, who had survived Pearl Harbor and Midway and the desperate carrier battles of 1942, who had watched American naval aviation evolve from peacetime routines to desperate improvisation to calculated dominance, now stood on the deck of Essex and felt something close to awe at what American industry had created in less than 2 years. Essex was massive, was 872 feet long compared to Enterprise's 809 feet, displaced 27,100 tons compared to Enterprise's 19,800 tons, carried 90 aircraft compared to Enterprise's 70. But the differences weren't just about size, they were about capability, about lessons learned, about taking everything the Navy had discovered in 2 years of brutal combat and building it into a ship designed specifically to destroy Japanese naval aviation, and Winters had spent the last 3 weeks learning Essex's systems, walking her decks, talking to her crew, and Winters realized that Essex wasn't just bigger than Enterprise, she was fundamentally different, was a purpose-built killing machine that made the pre-war carrier designs look like experimental prototypes, and the Japanese, who still operated carriers designed in the 1930s, who had lost 4 fleet carriers at Midway and were desperately building replacements using outdated designs, had no answer to what America was about to deploy into the Pacific. Winters knew exactly what every Japanese naval officer was thinking right now, the same thing Admiral Yamamoto had predicted in 1941, when he warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months. But after that, American industrial capacity would overwhelm Japanese resources, and Yamamoto had been exactly right, because here in August 1943, 20 months after Pearl Harbor, America was commissioning Essex, the first of 24 identical fleet carriers that would be built in less than 3 years. 24 carriers built faster than Japan could replace the 4 lost at Midway, 24 carriers that would carry more aircraft than the entire Japanese Navy possessed, 24 carriers that would make Japanese naval aviation obsolete not through superior tactics or better pilots, but through overwhelming industrial superiority. But what bothered Japanese strategists most, what kept Admiral Koga, who replaced Yamamoto, awake at night, wasn't just the number of Essex-Class carriers, but the speed at which America built them, because Essex's keel was laid in April 1941. She was launched in July 1942, and she was commissioned in December 1942. 20 months from keel to combat ready, and America was building these ships at a rate of 1 every 3 months at multiple shipyards simultaneously, and Japan, which took 3 years to build a fleet carrier and had shipyard capacity for maybe 2 carriers at a time, couldn't compete with that production rate, couldn't replace losses, couldn't maintain force parity, couldn't do anything except watch as American carrier strength grew exponentially while Japanese strength declined steadily. Winters had watched this industrial race from the beginning, had been at Pearl Harbor on December 7 when Japanese carrier aviation was ascendant, had seen the desperate months of 1942, when America fought with 3 fleet carriers against Japan's 6, had witnessed Midway, where American pilots flying obsolete aircraft from outmatched carriers had somehow won through courage and luck. But Winters knew that 1944 Would be different would be the year when American industrial power translated into operational dominance, would be the year when Essex-Class carriers made Japanese naval aviation obsolete, and Winters standing on Essex's flight deck in August 1943 was looking at the instrument that would win the Pacific War not through heroism or tactical brilliance, but through systematic industrial superiority. Captain Miles Browning, Chief of Staff to Admiral Spruance, had told Winters during the pre-deployment briefing that Essex represented the most significant advancement in carrier design since carriers were invented, and Winters, who'd studied naval architecture at Annapolis, understood what Browning meant. Essex wasn't an evolution of the Yorktown class, she was a revolution, was a complete rethinking of carrier design based on combat lessons that American naval architects had learned the hard way during 1942. And the first difference Winters noticed was the flight deck, which on Essex was 862 feet long and 108 feet wide compared to Enterprise's 809 by 86 feet, and that extra deck space meant Essex could spot more aircraft for launch, could conduct more efficient deck operations, could turn aircraft around faster between sorties, and in carrier combat where the side that could launch more strikes faster usually won, flight deck efficiency was a force multiplier that translated directly into combat power. But the flight deck was just the beginning. Essex had a deck edge elevator on the port side in addition to two centerline elevators, and Winters, who'd coordinated flight operations on Enterprise, understood immediately why this mattered. Centerline elevators cut through the armored hangar deck, created structural weak points that could be exploited by bombs, and during flight operations a damaged centerline elevator disabled the entire flight deck. But Essex's deck edge elevator was outside the armored hull, could be damaged without compromising the ship's structural integrity, could be repaired more easily, and most importantly allowed flight operations to continue even if one elevator was disabled, and this seemingly minor design change meant Essex could sustain more battle damage and keep fighting where older carriers would be crippled. Winters walked through Essex's hangar deck and saw another innovation. The deck was 17 feet high compared to Enterprise's cramped space, which meant maintenance crews could work on aircraft engines without disassembly, could perform repairs faster, could turn aircraft around for second and third sorties while Enterprise crews were still pulling engines, and Winters, who'd watched Enterprise's maintenance personnel struggle with inadequate hangar space, understood that this extra height was worth its weight in combat aircraft, because in sustained operations the carrier that could generate more sorties per day would dominate the carrier that had to choose between launch capacity and maintenance efficiency. But what impressed Winters most was Essex's defensive armament: 40 quad-mounted 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns and 52 20mm Oerlikon cannons, creating a defensive envelope that could put 10,000 rounds per minute into the air. And Winters, who'd stood on Enterprise's deck during Japanese air attacks, who'd watched Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes break through inadequate anti-aircraft fire, who'd seen what a single bomb hit could do to a carrier's flight deck, understood that Essex's defensive firepower represented a fundamental shift in carrier survivability, because Japanese pilots in 1944 would face defensive fire 10 times heavier than what they'd faced at Pearl Harbor, would have to penetrate a wall of high-explosive shells just to reach bomb release point, and the loss rates would be catastrophic. And then there was the aviation fuel capacity, 240,000 gallons compared to Enterprise's 180,000 gallons, which meant Essex could sustain operations longer without refueling, could operate further from support vessels, could maintain higher operational tempo, and in the Pacific where logistics determined operational range, fuel capacity meant the difference between maintaining pressure on the enemy and having to withdraw to refuel at critical moments. Winters compiled his observations in a report to Admiral Spruance, and Winters wrote, "Essex represents not an incremental improvement, but a categorical leap in carrier capability. Ship to ship, Essex is superior to any carrier Japan operates. When America deploys 10 Essex-class carriers simultaneously, Japanese naval aviation will be operationally obsolete regardless of pilot quality or tactical doctrine. September 1943. An Essex was conducting shakedown operations off the California coast, and Winters stood in the carrier's Combat Information Center watching radar screens that showed aircraft positions out to 120 miles. And Winters, who'd worked with Enterprise's primitive radar that barely reached 40 miles, understood that this detection range advantage meant Essex could intercept enemy aircraft 3 times further from the fleet, could direct combat air patrol with precision impossible on older carriers, could prevent the kind of surprise attacks that had damaged Enterprise at Eastern Solomons, and Winters realized that Essex wasn't just a bigger carrier, she was a more intelligent carrier, was a ship designed around information warfare where radar and radio allowed centralized control of air operations. But what truly made Essex revolutionary wasn't any single feature, it was the integration of all features into a coherent system optimized for sustained offensive operations, because Essex could carry 90 aircraft, could launch 40 aircraft in 10 minutes through efficient deck spotting, could recover those aircraft, refuel and rearm them, and launch them again within 90 minutes. And that cycle time meant Essex could generate 3 full deckload strikes in the time Enterprise needed. For 2, and multiplied across 10 Essex-class carriers operating together, that meant American task forces could put 400 aircraft over a target every 3 hours, while Japanese carrier forces that took longer to cycle aircraft could manage maybe 200 aircraft every 4 hours. And the mathematics of force multiplication meant American carriers would achieve air superiority simply through higher sortie generation rates. Winters reviewed the production schedule that Admiral King had shared with senior staff. Essex commissioned December 1942. Yorktown, CV-10, commissioned April 1943. Intrepid commissioned August 1943. Hornet, CV-12, commissioning in November 1943. Franklin in January 1944. Lexington, CV-16, in February 1944. Bunker Hill in May 1944. And the list continued, 24 carriers total with commissioning dates extending through 1945. And Winters calculated that by June 1944, America would have 10 Essex-class carriers operational in the Pacific, and by December 1944, that number would reach 15, and each carrier would carry 90 aircraft for total air group strength of 1,350 aircraft on Essex-class carriers alone, not counting the 9 Independence-class light carriers also being built, not counting the older carriers still in service. And Winters understood that Japan, which started the war with 10 fleet carriers and now had 6 after Midway losses, couldn't possibly match this force expansion, couldn't build carriers fast enough to maintain parity, couldn't train pilots fast enough to replace combat losses, couldn't produce aircraft fast enough to equip new air groups. The Japanese understood this too. Intelligence intercepts showed Admiral Koga telling his staff in September 1943 that American carrier production has reached levels that make force parity impossible. We must seek decisive battle before American numerical superiority becomes overwhelming. But Koga's problem was that American superiority was already overwhelming, was growing every month, was exponential rather than linear, and seeking decisive battle against an enemy with superior numbers and superior technology and superior logistics was suicide. But not seeking battle meant allowing America to advance unopposed, meant losing the Philippines and Formosa and eventually the home islands, and Koga was trapped between impossible alternatives. Winters saw the strategic situation clearly. Japan had lost the carrier war not at Midway where 4 carriers sank, but in April 1941. When Essex's keel was laid, had lost when American shipyards began mass-producing fleet carriers at a rate Japan couldn't match, had lost when American industrial capacity proved exactly as decisive as Yamamoto had predicted. August 31, 1943. And Essex launched her first combat strike against Marcus Island, and Winters coordinated the launch from primary flight control, and Winters watched as 36 fighters and dive bombers launched in 12 minutes, watched as the deck crew executed a ballet of aircraft movement and ordnance handling and fuel operations that was faster and cleaner than anything Winters had seen on Enterprise. And Winters understood that this wasn't just good training, this was superior design allowing. Superior operations was a flight deck layout that made efficient aircraft handling inevitable rather than aspirational. The strike aircraft returned 3 hours later, and Essex recovered all 36 aircraft in 18 minutes, and Winters, who'd watched Enterprise take 40 minutes to recover similar numbers because of cramped deck space and limited elevator capacity, understood that Essex's recovery rate meant she could get aircraft back aboard and out of harm's way faster, could reduce the window when returning aircraft were vulnerable to enemy fighters, could minimize fuel emergencies by getting aircraft on deck before tanks ran dry, and every advantage compounded into others. Every design improvement cascaded into operational benefits that made Essex not just bigger, but better in ways that mattered in combat. Over the next 3 months, as Essex participated in raids against Wake Island and the Gilbert Islands and Rabaul, Winters kept detailed logs comparing Essex's performance to Enterprise's historical performance, and the data was striking. Essex averaged 120 sorties per day during sustained operations compared to Enterprise's 85 sorties per day. Essex could maintain 3/4 of her air group in operational status compared to Enterprise's 2/3 due to better maintenance facilities. Essex's combat air patrol could maintain continuous coverage at 40 miles from the fleet compared to Enterprise's 30 miles due to better radar direction, and most tellingly, Essex had absorbed battle damage during the Rabaul raid, took a near miss from a Japanese bomb that damaged the deck edge elevator, and continued operations without interruption while Enterprise had been forced to withdraw to Pearl Harbor for repairs after similar damage at Eastern Solomons. But the real test came in November 1943. During the Gilbert Islands campaign, when Essex operated as part of Task Force 50 alongside 3 other new Essex-Class carriers, Yorktown, Bunker Hill, and Lexington, and for the first time in the war American carrier forces outnumbered Japanese carrier forces, outweighed them, outfought them, and Japanese naval aviation, which had dominated the Pacific for 2 years, suddenly found itself on the defensive. Suddenly couldn't contest American operations, suddenly was forced to withdraw from combat areas rather than risk confrontation with overwhelming American carrier power. Winters stood in Essex's flag plot during the Battle of Tarawa, watching radar screens that showed American combat air patrol destroying Japanese reconnaissance aircraft before they could report task force positions, watching as American strike aircraft suppressed Japanese airfields on Tarawa and Macon, watching as amphibious forces landed under continuous air cover that Japanese forces couldn't challenge, and Winters realized he was witnessing the practical demonstration of American carrier superiority, was watching Essex and her sisters do in November 1943 what Enterprise had struggled to do alone in 1942. Was seeing the Pacific War transform from a contest between near-equal forces into an industrial steamroller where American production capacity simply overwhelmed Japanese resistance. Admiral Spruance said it best after the Gilbert Islands campaign, Essex-class carriers have made Japanese carrier doctrine obsolete. The Japanese built their carrier force around the concept of quality over quantity, better trained pilots flying from elite carriers executing perfect operations. But Essex proves that quantity has a quality all its own. We can now put more aircraft, more tonnage, more combat power into every engagement, and Japanese quality cannot overcome American quantity. December 1943. and Essex's air group had transitioned completely to F-6F Hellcat fighters, replacing the older F-4F Wildcats that had fought at Midway, and Winters, who'd watched Wildcat pilots struggle against superior Zeros, understood that the Hellcat was to fighters what Essex was to carriers, a purpose-built weapon designed specifically to destroy Japanese aviation. And the Hellcat carried 6.50 caliber machine guns compared to the Wildcat's 4, had 2,000 horsepower compared to the Wildcat's 1,200, could reach 380 miles per hour compared to the Wildcat's 318, and most importantly could absorb tremendous battle damage and keep flying where Wildcats would be shot down. But what made the Hellcat truly revolutionary wasn't raw performance, it was reliability and ease of maintenance, because Grumman had designed the Hellcat to be maintained by relatively inexperienced mechanics in primitive conditions, had designed every component to be accessible and replaceable without specialized tools, had designed the entire aircraft around the principle that in sustained combat operations maintainability was as important as performance, and Essex's maintenance crews could turn around a Hellcat for a second sortie in 45 minutes where Enterprise's crews needed 90 minutes for a Wildcat, and that difference meant Essex could generate more sorties per day, could maintain higher operational tempo, could keep Japanese forces under continuous pressure that wore down their defensive capability. And Essex carried 90 aircraft compared to Enterprise's 70, and of those 90, 54 were Hellcats compared to Enterprise's 36 Wildcats, which meant Essex could put 18 more fighters in the air during any engagement, could maintain stronger combat air patrol, could escort strikes with more fighters, could achieve local air superiority through simple numerical advantage, and when multiplied across 4 Essex-class carriers operating together, that meant American task forces could put over 200 Hellcats in the air simultaneously while Japanese carrier forces might manage 60 Zeros, and the 3-to-1 numerical advantage combined with the Hellcat's technical superiority meant American pilots with moderate training could defeat Japanese pilots with extensive training simply through overwhelming force. Winters reviewed combat reports from the Marshall Islands campaign in January 1944. And the kill ratios were extraordinary. Essex's air group claimed 43 Japanese aircraft destroyed against 3 Hellcats lost, a 14-to-1 ratio, and across Task Force 58 the combined ratio was 13-to-1, and Winters, who'd watched Enterprise pilots fight at 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratios in 1942, understood that American naval aviation had achieved total qualitative and quantitative superiority, had reached the point where Japanese pilots were simply target practice for Hellcat pilots who had better aircraft, better tactics, better training, better support, and better numbers. The Japanese tried to respond, tried to develop new fighters like the S-7M that could compete with the Hellcat. But Japanese industry couldn't produce these new aircraft in sufficient numbers, couldn't train pilots fast enough to replace losses, couldn't maintain the quality control necessary for reliable aircraft when production was dispersed to avoid bombing, and by mid-1944, Japanese naval aviation was dying not from lack of courage or tactical skill, but from industrial insufficiency, from the simple reality that America could build 10 aircraft for every one Japan built, could train 10 pilots while Japan trained one, could sustain losses that would cripple Japanese air groups. Winters calculated that if current trends continued, Japanese carrier aviation would be effectively extinct by late 1944. Would have insufficient aircraft and pilots to operate from carriers even if the carriers survived, would be reduced to land-based operations where American forces would destroy them through attrition, and the Essex-class carriers that made this possible would spend 1945 not fighting Japanese carriers, but conducting shore bombardment and close air support because there would be no Japanese naval aviation left to fight. June 19, 1944. And Commander Winters stood in Essex's Combat Information Center during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, watching radar screens that showed Japanese aircraft approaching in multiple waves, watched as Task Force 58's 7 Essex-Class carriers and 8 light carriers prepared to receive the largest Japanese carrier air attack since 1942. And Winters, who'd experienced Japanese air attacks from the vulnerable position of being outnumbered in 1942, now watched from the secure position of overwhelming superiority, because Task Force 58 had 900 aircraft compared to the Japanese First Mobile Fleet's 430, had 15 carriers compared to Japan's 9, had the Hellcat versus the Zero, had radar-directed combat air patrol versus Japanese visual search, and Winters knew before the first Japanese aircraft came within range that this battle would not be close. At 1,000 hours, the first Japanese wave of 69 aircraft hit American defenses, and Essex's radar-directed Hellcats intercepted them 70 miles from the fleet, shot down 42 before they reached the outer defensive screen, and the 27 that penetrated to the fleet faced combined anti-aircraft fire from 15 carriers and 58 escort vessels, faced the withering defensive fire that Essex's designers had built into every ship, and only 3 Japanese aircraft survived to make attack runs, and all 3 missed, and 66 of 69 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in exchange for 0 American ships damaged, and Winters, who'd watched Japanese aircraft break through Enterprise's defenses in 1942 and damaged the carrier with bombs and torpedoes, couldn't believe the one-sided massacre he was witnessing. The second wave fared worse. 109 Japanese aircraft approached, and Essex and her sisters put up 250 Hellcats to intercept, and the Japanese formation was destroyed before reaching the fleet. 97 aircraft shot down, 12 turned back, 0 hits on American ships, and Winters listened to radio calls from Hellcat pilots who described the Japanese formations as turkeys at a turkey shoot, described how Japanese pilots flew in tight formations that made them easy targets, described how Japanese aircraft burned after a single burst because they lacked self-sealing fuel tanks and armor protection, described how Japanese pilots seemed poorly trained, seemed to make rookie mistakes, seemed to be replacement pilots thrown into combat without sufficient preparation. And Winters realized what was happening. Japan had lost its elite carrier pilots at Midway and Coral Sea and Eastern Solomons, had lost the veterans who'd attacked Pearl Harbor and invaded the Dutch East Indies, and the replacements, the pilots Japan was sending into battle in 1944, had received maybe 60 hours of flight training compared to the 200 hours American pilots received, couldn't execute coordinated attacks, couldn't handle modern air-to-air combat, were flying inferior aircraft against superior pilots and superior aircraft supported by superior radar and superior tactics, and the result was the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where 350 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in one afternoon against 29 American aircraft lost. But the Turkey Shoot wasn't just about pilot quality or aircraft performance, it was about the industrial system that supported American operations, because after the battle Essex and her sisters recovered damaged aircraft, repaired them overnight, and launched full strikes the next morning while Japanese carriers that survived had lost so many aircraft they couldn't conduct offensive operations, and when American submarines and bombers attacked the Japanese fleet on June 20 and sank carrier Hyo and damaged 2 others, Japanese naval aviation died not because carriers were sunk, but because the carriers had no aircraft and no trained pilots to operate from them. Winters watched the battle damage reports come in that evening. Task Force 58 had destroyed 450 Japanese aircraft over 2 days, had damaged 3 carriers, had sunk 2 oilers and shot down 29 American aircraft, and the mathematical result was clear: Japanese carrier aviation was finished, was no longer capable of offensive operations, was reduced to defending the home islands with land-based aircraft, and Essex and her sisters had accomplished in 2 days what would have taken years of attrition warfare in 1942. Had achieved through industrial superiority what could never have been achieved through tactical brilliance alone. If you want to see how Essex-class carriers completed the destruction of Japanese naval aviation, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories of American industrial might. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Admiral Spruance's assessment after the battle said it all. The Essex-Class carrier program has made Japanese carrier operations obsolete. Ship for ship we are superior. Fleet to fleet we are overwhelming. The question is no longer whether we will win the carrier war, but how quickly Japanese naval aviation will cease to exist as an effective force. August 1944. And Winters was reassigned to Pearl Harbor to help coordinate training for new Essex-Class carrier air groups, because America was commissioning carriers faster than they could be staffed with experienced personnel, and Winters, who'd seen American carrier forces grow from 3 in 1942 to 15 in 1944, understood that this expansion wasn't just about building ships, it was about creating entire operational systems, training crews, developing doctrine, establishing logistics, and the fact that America could do all of this simultaneously while fighting a two-ocean war was the real demonstration of industrial superiority. Winters reviewed the production statistics that had just been declassified for senior staff: 24 Essex-Class carriers ordered, 14 commissioned by August 1944. 10 more under construction with commissioning dates through 1946. And each carrier cost $70 million and required 3 million man-hours to build, and Newport News Shipbuilding and New York Naval Shipyard and Philadelphia Naval Yard and Four River Shipyard were all building these ships simultaneously, were launching carriers every 3 months, were employing 200,000 workers across all yards, and the production rate meant America would have 20 commissioned Essex-Class carriers by the end of 1945. 20 identical ships with interchangeable parts and standardized procedures and uniform capabilities. And Winters compared these numbers to Japanese carrier production. Japan had commissioned 1 fleet carrier since Pearl Harbor, Taiho, and had 3 more under construction that wouldn't be completed until 1945. And Japan's total carrier building capacity was maybe 1 fleet carrier per year compared to America's 8 per year. And even if Japan could match American shipbuilding speed, which they couldn't because Japan had a quarter of American steel production and half the shipyard capacity, Japan couldn't crew these ships because Japan had lost too many trained sailors and pilots, couldn't maintain them because Japan's logistics were strained supporting existing forces, couldn't fuel them because American submarines were sinking Japanese oil tankers faster than Japan could protect them. But Essex-Class production was only part of American carrier dominance. The 9 Independence-class light carriers converted from Cleveland-class cruiser hulls added another dimension, added fast carriers that could operate with the Essex-Class, that could screen the battle line, that could provide additional air defense, and America built these light carriers in 18 months compared to the 36 months needed for Essex-Class, and the combined production of Essex-Class and Independence-class carriers meant American task forces would grow from 15 carriers in mid-1944 to 28 carriers by early 1945. And Japanese naval forces that started the war with numerical superiority would face numerical inferiority of 3-1 or 4-1. Winters spent weeks at Pearl Harbor training new air group commanders for the Essex-class carriers still working up, and Winters taught them what he'd learned, that Essex's advantage wasn't any single feature, but the integration of superior design with superior logistics with superior industrial support, that a carrier was only as good as its supply chain, that the ability to maintain high sortie rates depended on having adequate spare parts and maintenance personnel and aviation fuel and ordnance, and America had all of these things in abundance while Japan was running out of everything. And Winters showed them the statistics that proved American superiority. The average Essex-class carrier had 98% parts availability compared to Japanese carriers' 70%, could maintain 80% of her air group in operational status compared to Japanese 60%, could sustain flight operations for 30 days without replenishment compared to Japanese 15 days, and these seemingly minor logistics differences compounded into overwhelming operational advantages that meant American carriers could fight harder, longer, and more effectively than Japanese carriers even if the ships were theoretically equal. By September 1944, Task Force 38 operating in Philippine waters had 11 Essex-Class carriers and 5 light carriers, 16 carriers total carrying 1,400 aircraft, and Japanese naval aviation had maybe 300 carrier-capable aircraft remaining, and the mathematical imbalance was so extreme that American task force commanders stopped worrying about Japanese carrier strikes and started planning shore bombardment operations and close air support missions because there were no Japanese naval forces left to fight. October 25, 1944. And Commander Winters was back aboard Essex off the Philippines during the Battle of Leyte Gulf when the first organized kamikaze attacks began, and Winters watched from the flight deck as Japanese aircraft deliberately crashed into American carriers, watched as Essex's sister ship Franklin took a kamikaze hit that killed 56 crew and temporarily disabled her flight deck, and Winters understood immediately that this new tactic represented Japanese admission of defeat in conventional carrier operations, represented the moment when Japan acknowledged that they could no longer win through superior tactics or training or equipment and had resorted to suicide attacks because suicide attacks were the only way remaining pilots could damage American ships. The kamikaze tactic was born from desperation and mathematics. Japan had 300 carrier-capable pilots remaining. But 1,500 aircraft had more planes than pilots, and untrained pilots couldn't execute coordinated attacks or dogfight Hellcats or conduct precision bombing. But untrained pilots could fly a plane into a ship, could turn themselves into guided missiles, could trade one aircraft and one pilot for potential carrier damage, and the mathematics seemed favorable to Japanese commanders because America might have overwhelming material superiority. But Japan had cultural willingness to sacrifice that America lacked. But the kamikazes proved that Essex's designers had anticipated everything, because Essex was built to absorb punishment, was armored against bombs and torpedoes, had damage control systems that could contain fires and flooding, had redundant systems that kept her operational even after hits, and when kamikaze aircraft hit Essex-class carriers, the results were survivable, damaged, but operational casualties. But not catastrophic, temporary disruption. But not permanent disability, and Essex and her sisters absorbed kamikaze strikes that would have sunk older carriers and remained in action. Winters documented every kamikaze attack on Essex-class carriers through the Philippines campaign. Essex hit once with light damage, Franklin hit twice with moderate damage, Intrepid hit 4 times with heavy damage. But never sunk. Bunker Hill hit twice, including a devastating double strike that killed nearly 400 crew. But the ship survived, and the pattern was consistent. Kamikaze attacks could damage Essex-class carriers, could kill crew, could disable flight decks temporarily, but couldn't sink them, couldn't remove them permanently from combat, couldn't achieve the decisive results that Japanese commanders hoped for. And the cost to Japan was catastrophic. 1,500 kamikaze pilots died in attacks against American carriers between October 1944 and August 1945. 1,500 irreplaceable pilots thrown away in suicide attacks that sank 0 fleet carriers, that achieved temporary damage at best, that proved finally and definitively that Japan could no longer compete with American industrial capacity, because America could repair damaged carriers faster than Japan could damage them, could build new carriers faster than kamikazes could sink them, could train new pilots faster than Japan could recruit suicide volunteers. By March 1945, When kamikaze attacks reached their peak during the Okinawa campaign, American forces had 23 Essex-Class and Independence-class carriers operational in the Pacific, and kamikaze attacks had sunk 0 fleet carriers and damaged 12 carriers temporarily, and American shipyards were repairing damaged carriers in weeks rather than months, and the industrial equation that had doomed Japan in 1943 was even more decisive in 1945. America could sustain losses that would cripple Japan, could absorb damage that would sink Japanese ships, could maintain operational tempo that exhausted Japanese defenses. April 1945. And Commander Winters flew over Ulithi Atoll and counted the carriers below: 17 Essex-class carriers at anchor, 8 Independence-class light carriers, 2 older Yorktown-class carriers, 27 carriers total, representing the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled, and Winters, who'd been at Pearl Harbor in 1941. When America had 3 carriers in the Pacific, couldn't believe how completely the strategic situation had reversed, how totally American industrial capacity had overwhelmed Japanese resources. The final accounting was stark. America commissioned 24 Essex-class carriers between 1942 and 1946. Operated 17 simultaneously during the Okinawa campaign, maintained carrier forces that outnumbered Japanese carrier forces 5-1 by 1945. And Japanese carrier aviation that had attacked Pearl Harbor with 6 fleet carriers and 414 aircraft now had 0 operational fleet carriers and fewer than 50 carrier-capable aircraft remaining. Essex-class carriers had participated in every major Pacific campaign after 1943. Gilbert Islands, Marshall Islands, Marianas, Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the final strikes against the Japanese home islands, had flown over 300,000 combat sorties, had destroyed over 10,000 Japanese aircraft, had sunk hundreds of Japanese ships, had supported every amphibious landing, had demonstrated beyond question that American industrial capacity had made Japanese carrier doctrine obsolete not through superior tactics, but through overwhelming production. The cost to build this fleet, 24 carriers at $70 million each. $1.68 billion total, which sounds enormous until you realize that America's GDP in 1944 was $200 billion, meaning the entire Essex-class program cost less than 1% of annual GDP, and America built these carriers while simultaneously building battleships and cruisers and destroyers and submarines and amphibious ships and cargo vessels and aircraft and tanks and artillery and everything else needed to fight a 2-ocean war. Japan couldn't compete. Started the war with 10 fleet carriers and ended with 0. Lost 4 at Midway, lost 3 to submarine and aircraft attacks, lost 3 to kamikaze conversion or lack of aircraft and pilots. Built 4 new carriers during the war, but couldn't crew or equip them. Ended the war with Japanese carriers sitting in port unused because there were no aircraft, no pilots, no fuel, no reason to sortie. Winters stood on Essex's deck in August 1945. When Japan surrendered, and Winters thought about Enterprise, the old carrier he'd served on in 1942. The carrier that had fought alone against superior forces, the carrier that had survived through courage and luck, and Winters understood that Enterprise's sacrifice had bought time for Essex, had held the line until American industry could produce the ships that would win the war. September 2, 1945. And Commander Robert Winters stood on Essex's flight deck in Tokyo Bay watching the surrender ceremony aboard USS Missouri, watching Japanese representatives sign the documents that ended World War II, and Winters thought about the journey that had brought him here, thought about the difference between the desperate defense of 1942 and the overwhelming offense of 1945. Thought about how industrial capacity had proven more decisive than tactical brilliance or warrior spirit or technological innovation. Essex-class carriers had won the Pacific War not through superior combat performance, though they were superior, but through superior production capacity, through the simple reality that America could build carriers faster than Japan could sink them, could train pilots faster than Japan could kill them, could produce aircraft faster than Japan could destroy them, and this industrial advantage had made Japanese carrier aviation obsolete by mid-1943. Had made Japanese resistance futile by 1944. Had made Japanese surrender inevitable by 1945. The lessons that Essex taught went beyond carrier design. They proved that wars between industrial powers are won in shipyards and factories and training centers before battles are fought. They proved that quantity has a quality all its own, that overwhelming production can defeat tactical excellence. They proved that Admiral Yamamoto was right when he warned that attacking America would awaken a sleeping giant, because American industrial capacity once fully mobilized was unstoppable. 24 Essex-class carriers built in less than 4 years. Each carrier carrying 90 aircraft. Each aircraft maintained by trained crew. Each crew supplied by functioning logistics. Each logistics chain supported by American industrial production that Japan couldn't match or disrupt or overcome. Japanese carriers weren't defeated by better American carriers. They were defeated by more American carriers. They were defeated by the Essex-class production program that made numerical superiority inevitable. They were defeated by American industrial might that turned carrier warfare from tactical art into mathematical equation where Japan couldn't win because Japan couldn't build fast enough. Commander Robert Winters retired from the Navy in 1965. As a rear admiral. He'd served on Enterprise during desperate defense, on Essex during overwhelming offense. He'd witnessed the transition from scarcity to abundance, from improvisation to industrial system. Essex-class carriers served through Korea, through Vietnam, through the Cold War. Last one decommissioned in 1991. 50 years of service proving that good design plus mass production creates capability that lasts generations. Today at the Patriots Point Naval Museum in South Carolina, USS Yorktown, CV-10, is preserved as memorial to Essex-class carriers and the industrial victory they represented. The placard reads, Essex-class carriers, the ships that made Japanese carrier aviation obsolete through American industrial superiority. 24 built. 0 sunk. War won. That's the legacy of Essex-class carriers. Not individual heroism or tactical brilliance, but systematic industrial dominance that made Japanese resistance futile. That's how America won the carrier war. Not by building better ships, but by building more ships. Not through superior quality, but through overwhelming quantity. That's the story Essex-class carriers tell, the story of industrial might defeating warrior spirit, of production capacity overwhelming tactical skill, of American shipyards proving more decisive than Pacific battlefields. Commander Robert Winters understood this in 1945. We should remember it today.